He crashed his truck into a guardrail. From exhaustion, the state trooper who showed up changed his life forever. Silas Braddock felt the truck's front tire catch the shoulder gravel a half second before he registered. He drifted. And by the time his hands corrected the wheel, the passenger side had already kissed the guardrail hard enough to crumple the quarter panel and send a shower of orange sparks skittering across the wet asphalt behind him in the mirror. He got the truck stopped on the shoulder, maybe 40 yards past the point of impact. Hands still on the wheel at 10 and 2, engine idling rough for a second before settling, and sat there in the dark with rain coming down steady on the windshield, replaying the half second where his eyes had drifted somewhere other than the road without ever fully deciding to. He was 34, a journeyman lineman for Tri-County Electric Cooperative, and he'd just come off 16 straight hours restoring power to a stretch of county line that a spring storm had knocked flat, down conductor lines, and a snapped crossarm on top of 2 transformers that needed swapping before anybody in 3 townships got their lights back. He'd gone straight from that shift to a morning that started at 5:30, getting his father fed and dressed and settled before the visiting nurse's appointment. And somewhere between no sleep and a stretch of unlit 2-lane highway, with the rain coming down harder than the wipers could keep up with, his attention had slipped for the length of one blink too many. He'd been putting off exactly this kind of night for months, telling himself the storm season would ease up eventually, telling himself Denise's visits would start covering enough ground that he could actually sleep through a full night sometime soon. And somewhere in the space between those 2 half-true promises, he'd run himself down to the particular kind of exhausted where the body keeps functioning a full beat behind where the mind actually is. No other car involved, nobody hurt. Just a crumpled quarter panel and a guardrail that had done exactly what guardrails were built to do. He sat there another few seconds doing the same mental inventory he'd have run on a customer's down line, checking each system in order. Hands steady enough now. Breathing evened out. No pain anywhere that mattered before he finally reached for his hazards and waited for whoever was going to show up and make this officially somebody else's problem to document. The patrol car's light bar lit up his rear view about 10 minutes later, blue and red washing across the wet guardrail and the fog glass of his own windshield, and Silas rolled his window down as the trooper approached on foot, flashlight angled low so it wouldn't blind him, rain beating on the brim of her hat. "Evening," she said, professional and even. "Trooper Fitch, State Patrol. You doing okay in there?" "Yeah," Silas said, and heard how rough his own voice came out, more shaken than he wanted to admit to a stranger. "Tire caught the shoulder. I overcorrected into the rail. Wasn't going more than 40. Trooper Fitch worked through it the way she worked through every call like this. License and registration first. A walk around the vehicle with her flashlight tracing the damage. A few standard questions about how he was feeling, whether he'd hit his head, whether he needed medical attention. All of it delivered in the same level, unhurried tone, whether the answer mattered a little or a lot. She noted the road surface, slick with standing water in a stretch where the shoulder markings had worn thin enough that a tired driver could lose the exact edge of the lane without much warning. And she noted, without making a thing of it, that Silas's hands weren't quite steady on the wheel, even though his story checked out clean, and his eyes weren't glassy with anything but exhaustion. She'd worked enough overnight wrecks by now to know the specific difference between a driver hiding something and a driver simply running on empty. The second kind more common on this stretch of highway than anybody who didn't work it would guess. Shift workers and line crews and long-haul drivers, all funneling through the same unlit corridor at the exact hours their bodies were least equipped to handle it. "Any injuries in the impact?" she asked, flashlight sweeping the crumpled panel one more time. "No, ma'am," Silas said. "Just my pride and the truck. Truck'll live," Delaney said. And something in the flat, practical delivery of it eased the knot in Silas's chest by half a turn. She finished her walk around, made a few notes on her tablet, and came back to his window. "Given the road conditions out here and how clean your account checks out against the damage pattern, I'm filing this as a non-citation accident report. No moving violation on your record, no points, just the documentation for the guardrail damage the state's got to repair. But I'd strongly recommend pulling over somewhere safe if you're running on fumes like I think you are, because the next guardrail might not be there to catch you." "Copy that," Silas said and meant it, more grateful for the plain, unsentimental way she'd said it than he had words for right then. She didn't ask if he had somebody waiting on him, didn't offer advice he hadn't asked for, didn't linger past what the report required, just finished her notes, told him to drive safe, and walked back to her cruiser with her flashlight beam bouncing across the wet grass. And Silas sat there another minute before pulling back onto the road, watching her taillights fall away behind him in the mirror until the rain swallowed them whole. He got home a little after 9, the porch light on the way. His father always insisted it stay lit, even though Roy hadn't driven himself anywhere in over a year, and found Roy at the kitchen table doing the crossword by the light over the stove, reading glasses pushed down his nose, a mug of black coffee from the old percolator sitting cold at his elbow because he'd forgotten to drink it. Roy Braddock was 68, a retired pipe fitter with 40 years in the trade behind him. Diagnosed 8 months back with early-stage Alzheimer's after a fall in the bathroom that had scared both of them enough to finally get the testing done, and most nights he still had more good hours than bad ones, sharp enough to argue Silas into the ground about a 7-letter word for a type of knot before losing the thread of what day it was 20 minutes later. "You're late," Roy said, not looking up from the puzzle. "Storm crew running you into the ground again?" "Something like that," Silas said, not mentioning the guardrail, not yet ready to hand his father one more thing to worry about processing. He checked the pill organizer on the counter out of habit, Monday through Sunday, sorted into little plastic compartments by Denise, the visiting nurse, 2 weeks back, confirmed the evening dose was gone from today's slot, and started reheating a plate Roy had clearly saved for him without being asked. "Your mother used to do that," Roy said, glancing up at the plate. "Save you food when you worked late." "I know, Dad," Silas said, gentle about it, the way he'd learned to be gentle about the specific handful of things that circled back around more than others. 20 minutes later, halfway through his reheated dinner, Roy asked with the same genuine curiosity as if it were the first time, whether Silas's mother was coming home soon, and Silas set his fork down and answered the same way he always did, patient, unhurried, no corrections sharp enough to sting. "She passed a few years back, Dad, remember? But I'm right here." Roy nodded slowly, something clouding and clearing behind his eyes in the span of a few seconds, and then, without any transition at all, cracked a dry joke about the crossword clue being written by somebody who'd clearly never held an actual wrench in his life, and Silas laughed for real, because that particular joke landing exactly on time was its own small, stubborn proof that his father was still entirely himself, underneath whatever the disease was slowly taking. Silas had learned, mostly by trial and a fair amount of error over the past 8 months, that the good stretches and the hard ones didn't announce themselves in any order he could plan around, which was most of why he'd stopped trying to predict them and started just meeting whichever version of the evening actually showed up. The crossword nights and the confused ones both, without treating either one as more real than the other. Delaney Fitch clocked out of her shift a little after 11 that same night, sat in the precinct parking lot for a minute before starting her car the way she did most nights, letting the trooper version of herself settle back down into something closer to an ordinary 29-year-old before she trusted herself to drive home. She texted her friend Priya from the academy, still awake apparently, something about grabbing lunch that weekend if their schedules actually lined up for once, and Priya wrote back a string of complaints about her own shift that made Delaney laugh out loud alone in her car. She hadn't thought about the guy at the guardrail once since finishing the report, filed clean and forgotten the way most calls were by the time she got home, laced up for a short run around her block instead, because the run did more for shaking off a 12-hour shift than anything else she'd tried in 6 years on patrol. Her brother Dax called while she was still lacing up her shoes, checking in the way he did most weeks, and she caught herself venting for a solid 5 minutes about a domestic call that had gone nowhere good, then hung up feeling lighter for having said it out loud to somebody who wasn't going to write it into a report. 3 weeks passed the way most weeks did for both of them. Silas working storm call-outs and ordinary line maintenance in between. Roy having 2 rough days and several good ones. Denise coming through on her regular rotation to check medication levels and ask her usual careful questions. Delaney working her patrol sector and her regular shifts and her Sunday runs. Neither of them thinking about the other at all until a Thursday evening in early May, when Silas pushed a cart down the cereal aisle of the grocery store 2 blocks from his house. The same store he'd been stopping at most Thursdays for years because it sat directly on his route home, And Thursday was the one evening a week his schedule reliably let him actually shop, instead of grabbing whatever was fastest. He recognized the jacket before he recognized the face, the same dark uniform jacket with the patch on the shoulder, and it took him a second to place her without the flashlight and the rain. But once he did, he found himself pushing his cart over before he'd fully decided to. "Trooper Fitch," he said, and she turned, blinking for a second, before recognition clicked into place on her end too. "Guardrail guy," she said, and something easy crossed her face, genuine rather than performed. "You look considerably less like a man who just hit a piece of highway infrastructure than you did last time I saw you." "Funny how a full night's sleep will do that," Silas said. "I never actually thanked you properly for handling that the way you did. Could have gone a lot worse for me that night, one way or another." "Just doing the job," Delaney said, and meant it plainly. No fishing for more credit than the moment actually called for. "Glad you made it home in one piece, truck notwithstanding." "Truck's still not thrilled about it," Silas said, "but it's driving straight again." He glanced at her cart, half full, nothing remarkable in it, then back at her. "You shop here a lot?" "Never clocked you in here before tonight." "Live about 6 blocks over," Delaney said. "Usually come through after a shift this time of night. Guess our schedules just never crossed before?" They talked another minute, nothing that would have sounded like much to anybody passing by. The store's terrible generic coffee brand. A joke about how the self-checkout machine always seemed to accuse Delaney specifically of an unexpected item in the bagging area. And then Delaney's phone buzzed with a text from Priya about their weekend plans, and she glanced at it, said she should probably let him finish shopping, and they parted with nothing more exchanged than a friendly nod and both of them continuing down their own separate aisles. Silas thought about it on the drive home, not in any particular way he could have named out loud if somebody had asked him to. Just a small, warm fact sitting somewhere in the back of his mind alongside the storm schedule, and Roy's pill organizer, and the quarter panel still waiting on a part he hadn't ordered yet. It was nice, running into a familiar face on an ordinary Thursday. That was all it was, as far as he let himself think about it, pulling into his own driveway under the porch light his father still insisted on leaving burning. Nothing more complicated than that, not yet. Delaney Fitch stood in the checkout line behind a guy arguing with the self-checkout machine about an unexpected item in the bagging area for the third Thursday running, and it took her a second longer than it should have to place why the sight of Silas Braddock losing a fight with a grocery scanner had become something she looked forward to on an otherwise unremarkable weekday evening. What started as one accidental run-in in a cereal aisle turned into 11 weeks of Thursdays that built into something neither of them had planned on. Right up until a night neither of them saw coming forced Silas to say the hardest true thing he'd said to anybody in longer than he could remember. The Thursdays that followed that first grocery run-in didn't turn into some tidy weekly romance, mostly because real life didn't work that way for either of them. Some weeks they talked for 20 minutes in the cereal aisle about nothing in particular. Some weeks Delaney got called into an unexpected shift change and never made it to the store at all. One Thursday, Silas showed up so wiped from a rough evening with Roy that he barely managed more than a tired wave before heading straight for the checkout, and Delaney, reading the exhaustion on his face accurately enough not to push, just waved back and let him go. Another week they ran into each other twice in one aisle by pure bad luck and spent the whole second pass laughing about how the store apparently only had one working register open on Thursdays no matter what. One particularly unremarkable Thursday in April, neither of them had much to say at all, both running on empty from separate hard weeks, and they ended up just walking the same 2 aisles together in comfortable silence before splitting off toward their own checkout lines, without either one forcing conversation that wasn't actually there that night, which somehow told Silas more about how easy this had gotten than any of their better conversations had. Slowly, without either of them narrating it as anything significant, the conversations picked up threads and carried them forward week to week instead of starting fresh every time. Delaney learned Silas cooked for one most nights, a habit that meant he'd never quite unlearned making enough for two, and he learned she'd given up trying to cook seriously years back. and mostly lived off whatever her air fryer could handle without supervision. They kept up the running joke about the store's off-brand coffee, Silas insisting it tasted like scorched cardboard, Delaney insisting it was fine if you added enough creamer to disguise the crime. Silas mentioned his father for the first time almost accidentally, a Thursday in late May, explaining why he'd grabbed a second bag of the soft dinner rolls Roy liked because regular bread had started giving him trouble with his dentures. "My dad's been living with me the past 8 months, Silas said, keeping it plain, no invitation for sympathy attached. "Early Alzheimer's, some days it's just background noise, some days it's the whole day." "That's a lot to carry," Delaney said, and didn't push further than that, which Silas noticed and appreciated more than a longer, more curious response would have earned from him. She gave him something back a few weeks later, unprompted, standing near the dairy case describing a domestic call from earlier that shift that hadn't ended clean. No gory details, just the honest weight of it. "Some calls just sit with you longer than others," she said. "Doesn't matter how many years you've got in, some of them still find the soft spot." "Yeah," Silas said, understanding that particular kind of accumulation better than most people would have. "I get that." It was Silas who finally said the thing neither of them had said out loud yet, standing in the parking lot on a Thursday in mid-June with both their carts loaded, neither one quite ready to say goodnight. "There's a diner on Fifth that does a decent breakfast," he said, working to keep his voice as plain as the offer. "You ever want to actually sit down somewhere that's not between the cereal and the checkout? I wouldn't hate that." "Yeah," Delaney said, something easy and real crossing her face. "I wouldn't hate that either." Saturday breakfast at the diner turned into an ordinary, unremarkable date. Eggs and bad coffee that was somehow worse than the grocery stores. Easy conversation that didn't need to prove anything to either of them. And it turned into a second one. 2 weeks after that, a walk around the reservoir on a warm evening where they talked more about nothing in particular than anything that mattered. Both of them quietly aware that this had stopped being coincidence and started being something they were choosing on purpose. At the diner, Delaney ordered her eggs over easy and then spent a full 5 minutes defending that choice against Silas's insistence that over easy was a structurally unsound way to eat breakfast. And by the time their plates actually arrived, they'd built out an entire ridiculous ranking system for egg preparations that neither of them could stop laughing about long enough to actually eat. At the reservoir 2 weeks later, Delaney told him about the academy, about Priya talking her through a bad stretch during their second year on patrol, when Delaney had seriously considered quitting, and Silas listened the same unhurried way she'd been listening to him about Roy for weeks now, neither of them rushing the other towards some tidier version of the story. The night that changed things came in July, hot enough that Silas had left the windows cracked for the breeze, and he'd stepped into the garage for maybe 15 minutes to check on a tube radio he'd been rebuilding on his workbench, the kind of small, absorbing task that let his brain go quiet for once. When he came back inside, Roy wasn't in his chair. He checked the bedroom first, then the bathroom, then the backyard, his voice staying level even as his pulse climbed, and it was the missing house key off the hook by the door that told him Roy had actually gone somewhere on his own 2 feet. His stomach had gone hollow in a way that had nothing to do with hunger by the time he confirmed it, running through the same mental checklist he'd run 100 times with Denise about what to do if this exact scenario ever happened. Check the immediate radius first. Call for help only if the radius search came up empty. Keep his own voice calm no matter what he found. Silas grabbed his truck keys and drove the immediate blocks first, slow, scanning both sides of the street, and found his father 11 minutes later a half-mile off, standing outside the old Union Hall where Roy had spent 3 decades of Tuesday meetings, a building that had been converted into an insurance office years back, looking at the darkened windows like he was waiting for a meeting that wasn't coming. "Dad," Silas said, easing the truck to the curb and getting out slow, careful not to spook him. "Let's get you home, all right?" Roy turned, and for several long, gutting seconds there was no recognition in his face at all. Just the wary, frightened look of a man confronted by a stranger in the dark. "Who are you?" Roy said, backing up half a step. I'm waiting on somebody. I can't just leave. It's Silas, Silas said, keeping his voice even though something in his chest was anything but, holding both hands loose and visible at his sides the way he'd been taught to when Roy got frightened like this. Denise had walked him through exactly this once, months back. Calm hands, calm voice, no sudden movement. Let him come to recognition on his own time instead of forcing it. And Silas leaned on every piece of that training now, even though nothing about doing it in real time on a dark sidewalk felt anywhere near as manageable as it had sitting at his own kitchen table, hearing it explain. Your son. We're going to go home, Dad. It's late. Roy stared at him a moment longer, something working behind his eyes, and then, all at once, the fear cleared, and his shoulders dropped, and he said, in his ordinary voice like none of the last 90 seconds had happened at all, Silas. Right. Guess I lost track of the time. He let Silas walk him to the truck without further argument, climbed in, and by the time they pulled back into the driveway, he was already asking about dinner like it was any other evening. Silas got his father settled and checked twice that the door was locked before he finally sat down at his own kitchen table and let his hands shake the way he hadn't allowed them to the whole time he was out searching. It wasn't the danger itself that undid him. Not really. Roy had been found safe inside 20 minutes total. Nothing close to a crisis by any official measure. It was the plain, unavoidable math of it, that a man who worked 16-hour storm shifts and left the house for 15 unsupervised minutes couldn't keep pretending his current arrangement had room to spare for anything else, including, as much as it cost him to admit it, a woman he'd started genuinely caring about on Thursday evenings. He called Delaney 2 days later, not over text, wanting to say it properly. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you decide what it means, he said, and she stayed quiet on the other end, giving him the room to get it out. My dad wandered off Tuesday night. Found him fine, nothing happened, but it scared me enough to see clearly what I've been telling myself wasn't true. I don't have the room in my life right now that I've been pretending I do. And I like you, Delaney. That's exactly why I need to stop pretending, instead of letting you find out the hard way 6 months from now. Delaney was quiet for a second, taking it in rather than reacting to it. I hear you, she said finally, steady, no wound in her voice, no argument either. I'm not going to tell you that's not real or talk you out of it. You know your own life better than I do. She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something gentler underneath the steadiness. I'd just ask you not to disappear completely. Whatever room you've got or don't got, I'd still like to know you're doing okay. I can do that, Silas said, and meant it. Grateful in a way he didn't fully have words for, that she hadn't made him defend the decision harder than he already had to defend it to himself. Take care of your dad, Delaney said, and take care of yourself too, while you're at it. Because from where I'm standing, you've been running on fumes longer than one guardrail's worth. They hung up without either of them promising anything more specific than that, and Delaney sat on her own couch afterward for a long minute, not devastated, not wounded, just quietly recalibrating what she'd let herself want without either overcorrecting into pretending she hadn't wanted it at all. She called Priya a little later, not looking for anybody to fix it, just wanting to say the shape of it out loud to somebody who'd let her be disappointed without immediately trying to talk her out of the disappointment. He's not wrong to step back, Delaney said, turning her water glass in slow circles on the counter. Doesn't mean it doesn't sting a little, hearing somebody be that honest with you instead of just going quiet. Priya didn't try to spin it into something better than it was, just let her say it. And somewhere in that, Delaney found the specific, unglamorous relief of being allowed to feel exactly what she felt, without an audience demanding she feel something tidier. 6 weeks after the phone call that ended their Thursdays, Delaney Fitch stood in her own kitchen, icing a half marathon she'd just run slower than she wanted to, phone propped against the fruit bowl, while Priya talked her through a rough patrol shift on speaker, and it took her a solid minute to notice she hadn't thought about Silas Braddock once that whole day, which felt less like relief and more like a small, honest marker of how a person's life kept moving, whether or not they wanted it to. What started as 6 weeks of two people quietly rebuilding their own separate lives turned into the season. Silas finally learned that accepting help wasn't the same thing as losing the fight, and it took him longer to learn that than either of them would have guessed back in July. Delaney hadn't chased him, not once. Not a text checking in, not a drive-by past the grocery store on a Thursday to see if he'd show. She kept running, kept working her patrol sector, kept her standing lunch with Priya, and let the specific ache of missing somebody she'd only known a few months settle into something she carried without making a project out of managing it. Silas, for his part, kept doing exactly what he'd told her he needed to do, working storm callouts, managing Roy's days. But somewhere in August, sitting across from Denise during one of her regular check-ins, he finally said out loud the thing he'd been avoiding since Roy's diagnosis 8 months back. "I keep hearing myself tell you I've got it handled," Silas said, turning a coffee mug slowly on the kitchen table, while Denise updated her notes. "I don't think that's true anymore. Hasn't been true for a while, if I'm honest." Denise didn't act surprised, just nodded like she'd been waiting for him to say it on his own timeline, instead of pushing him toward it. "There's a county-subsidized day program out on Route 9, she said. "I've mentioned it before, I know. 3 days a week, transportation included if you need it, activities geared for early-stage folks specifically. There's an opening right now. Wasn't sure you were ready to hear it before." "I wasn't," Silas admitted. "Guess I figured needing that meant I'd failed him somehow." "Using support isn't failing him," Denise said, plain about it. "It's the thing that lets you keep doing this for the long haul instead of running yourself into the ground by October." Roy did not take to the idea gently. "I don't need a babysitter," he said flatly. The first afternoon Silas brought it up, arms crossed the exact way he'd crossed them at every stubborn moment Silas could remember from childhood on. "I raised you, boy, not the other way around." "It's not a babysitter, Dad," Silas said, patient, not backing down either. "It's a place with activities and people your own age, 3 days a week. Gives us both a little room." Roy went the first Tuesday complaining the entire ride there about being hauled off like cargo, and came home that evening quieter than Silas expected. Not unhappy exactly, just processing. By the second week, he'd stopped complaining about the ride. By the third, he mentioned offhand over dinner that a fella named Frank at the program played a mean game of checkers, and Roy intended to finally beat him before the month was out. And Silas had to excuse himself to the sink for a second, so his father wouldn't see how hard that small, ordinary sentence hit him. By the fifth week, Roy had taken to laying out his checker strategy for Silas at dinner like a man planning a heist. And by the sixth, he actually beat Frank once, coming home so pleased with himself, he told the story twice in one evening without noticing he'd already told it, and Silas let him tell it twice anyway, because some victories were worth hearing about more than once, regardless of the reason. Silas ran into Delaney again on a Tuesday in September, not the grocery store, not engineered by either of them, just the hardware store where Silas had gone for a part for the radio he was still slowly rebuilding, and Delaney had gone for a new hose nozzle, both of them turning down the same aisle at the same moment. "Hey," Silas said, and something in his voice was steadier than the last time she'd heard it. "Hey yourself," Delaney said, taking him in, the particular ease in his shoulders that hadn't been there in July. "You look like a man who's actually sleeping." "Working on it," Silas said. "Dad started an adult day program a few weeks back. Took some getting used to, but it's helping. Turns out I had more room than I thought. I just needed somebody to tell me using it wasn't the same as giving up." They talked another 20 minutes right there in the hardware aisle, easy the way it used to be, and when Silas finally worked up to it, he asked if she'd want to actually meet Roy sometime. No pressure, whenever felt right. Delaney said she'd like that, and meant it. The meeting happened sooner than planned, on an ordinary Thursday, 2 weeks later, when Delaney stopped by to drop off a radio tube she'd found at a swap meet that Silas had mentioned needing, and walked into the middle of Roy in a genuinely frustrated state, convinced his crossword book had been stolen when it had simply been moved to the counter for cleaning, agitation climbing fast the way it sometimes did over something small enough that the smallness itself seemed to make it worse. Delaney didn't step in front of Silas. didn't try to fix it herself, didn't pretend to any expertise she didn't have. She just stood back a step, calm, present, and asked Silas quietly, "Tell me what usually helps," and then did exactly that and nothing more, staying out of the way while Silas walked his father through finding the book. Low voice, no rush, until Roy's shoulders finally came down and he apologized, embarrassed for the fuss. Roy, once he'd settled, looked over at Delaney with the particular sharp clarity he still had on his better afternoons and said, "You're the trooper he ran into at the grocery store. He talks about you more than he thinks I notice." Delaney laughed, caught off guard, and Silas felt his ears go warm the exact way they had the first night at the Guardrail, for entirely different reasons this time. "Sorry you had to see that," Silas said afterward, once Roy had settled back into his chair with the recovered crossword. "Nothing to be sorry about," Delaney said. "You handled that exactly right. I wasn't standing here thinking you needed rescuing, Silas. I was just glad to be somebody standing next to you while you did it." Something settled in Silas's chest hearing that, a specific, quiet relief that had nothing to do with being fixed, and everything to do with not being managed either, just accompanied, which turned out to be the thing he actually needed all along. Colleen flew in for her fall visit in October, and for the first time in 8 months, Silas actually let himself rest during it instead of using the week to catch up on every deferred chore in the house. He slept past 7 twice. He spent a whole Saturday afternoon at his workbench without checking his phone once. Colleen noticed, standing in the kitchen looking at the day program's schedule taped to the fridge next to Denise's number and a grocery list in Roy's own shaky handwriting. "You should have let yourself do this months ago," she said, not scolding, just honest, tired affection in it. "I wish I could do more from 3 states away than call Sundays and argue with the insurance company, but I'm glad somebody local's finally sharing the actual weight of this with you." She'd spent that same visit on the phone twice with Roy's insurance carrier, sorting out a billing error on the day program's subsidy paperwork, the kind of unglamorous long-distance help that never made it into a story anybody told, but mattered just as much as showing up in person would have. "Somebody local is," Silas said, and left it there, not quite ready to explain the whole thing yet, though Colleen's raised eyebrow told him she'd file the comment away for later questioning anyway. It was Delaney who said the thing that mattered most, a few weeks after the crossword afternoon, sitting on Silas's porch steps on an evening cool enough for jackets. "I need you to hear something plainly," she said, turning to face him instead of the yard. "I want to be someone in your life. I don't want to be somebody responsible for running it. I can stand next to you on a hard day, same as I did with the crossword thing, but I'm not signing up to manage your dad's care, and I don't think you actually want that from me either." "I don't," Silas said, immediate and sure. "I want you here because you want to be here, not because you've turned into some unpaid second set of hands. If this is going to work, it's got to be 2 people choosing each other, not one person rescuing the other." "Good, Ta," Delaney said, something easing in her own shoulders now. "Then let's actually try this, on purpose this time." She bumped her shoulder against his, easy and unhurried, the same steady physicality she brought to everything, and Silas found himself thinking that steadiness was probably the exact thing that had drawn him to her in the first place, back on a rain-soaked shoulder with a crumpled quarter panel and a stranger who treated him like a person instead of a mess to manage. They settled into Thursday dinners instead of Thursday parking lots after that. Nothing fixed or perfect about any of it. Roy still having hard days along with the good ones, Delaney still coming home some nights carrying a call she couldn't quite shake, both of them still juggling schedules that didn't always cooperate, but carrying all of it together now instead of each hauling their own weight alone in separate houses. Some Thursdays the dinner was good, real conversation, Roy holding court about something from his pipe-fitting days that Delaney had somehow never heard before. And some Thursdays it was just quiet, tired people eating in the same room. And both kinds counted now, in a way neither Silas nor Delaney would have known how to explain to anybody who hadn't lived through a version of the same slow, unglamorous rebuilding themselves. One evening in late November, Silas pulled into his driveway after a 9-hour storm restoration shift. Tired down to his bones the way only that particular kind of work left a person, and through the kitchen window he could see Delaney sitting at the table with Roy, the two of them clearly mid-argument about something. Roy's hands gesturing with the specific stubborn energy he brought to every disagreement he'd ever had in his life. Delaney laughing at whatever he'd just said instead of taking the bait. Silas didn't go in right away. He sat there in his cooling truck for a minute, just watching through the glass. Not because anybody had lifted his responsibilities off his shoulders, not because his father's disease had gotten any easier to carry, but because for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, somebody was standing inside the actual, unglamorous life he had instead of waiting politely outside it for the easier version to arrive.